So I'm going to just give a brief. I suppose I'll start by talking about. I mean, they said the topic was yeah. So the rights of foreign people, I suppose, who come to Ireland to work. So I'll just give a brief little outline of the kind of law, and then we can talk about stuff. And there's some campaigns and things going on at the moment as well that different organisations are doing that I want to talk to you about and make sure that you know about. The MRCI one, there was a lot of news coverage last week, so I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Some of you might have heard about that. So who can work in Ireland? So again, just a brief outline. So the people from outside the EEA are the people who have to get permission, work permits to work in Ireland. So the EEA is Europe plus, what is it, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, and somewhere else, Sweden, and Finland, I think. So it's basically the EU plus a couple of other ones that have kind of agreements with the European Union countries. So anyone that is from outside of those countries has to get a work permit to work in Ireland unless they have residency here for some other reason, which is a separate whole thing, right? And the work permit regime works like this. If you're in another country, you can apply for a work permit in Ireland. If you're in Ireland and you have some kind of irregular status, or you're an irregular migrant worker, in other words, you don't have documentation or something, it's kind of very, very difficult to get in the work permit scheme. So that's one of the problems with it. You'd have to go back to wherever you were from and apply for it from over there. And then how it works is that a worker can apply for a work permit, or an employer can apply for it. It doesn't really make any difference who applies for it, because in the end of the day the permit is granted and it's specific to the particular employer, right? So if you're working for an employer in Ireland, you can't move to another job. You have to stay really with that employer. That's the whole basis that the scheme works on at the moment, and that's the most contentious aspect of the scheme as well, I think. What else? So if you're here like that and you're working and you have a work permit and you're a regularised non-Irish worker working in Ireland, you come under all of the employment law stuff that we were talking about earlier on, right? So you have the equality legislation, and you have your unfair dismissals, and you have your wrongful dismissal if you're less than 12 months, which is much more difficult, but it's still there, and you have all that sort of thing, okay? But if you aren't properly documented, and your work permit is not, has lapsed for some reason, you are automatically excluded from all of the employment law that applies in Ireland and in Europe. So you lose the benefit of that. So that's the second big problem that I think exists in the work permit system. The first one is the fact that you're tied to the employer, which obviously gives the employer, it puts the employer in a really strong position vis-a-vis the employee. And then the second one is that if you somehow become undocumented, if your work permit lapses and it isn't renewed properly, even if it isn't your fault, you're excluded from all of the employment law legislation and you have absolutely no protection. Okay, so we have really good employment law in Ireland. I mean, there's problems with it and everything, but from what you heard from Noel earlier on, you can tell there's a big raft of things to protect people, and there really are a lot of ways that you can go, and maybe there's some problems with it, but it's really strong. But there's a whole vast number of people that are excluded from it due to problems with the work permit system. So how do people come to be outside of the work permit system? So a lot of people would have applied for work permits, come and work for an employer, find themselves being treated unfairly, and leave that employer, and they end up working without any kind of permission, kind of in the black market. Okay, that's one of the things that happens. The other then are people who come here who end up working, say, in the black market, we call it, right? They're not paying tax, and they may or may not have a PPS number, and even if they are paying tax, actually, which sometimes does happen, but if the permission to work isn't there, then you're outside of the employment legislation. So that's a big issue. So I don't know if any of you heard during the week and over the last few weeks, there was a good bit of stuff in the media about domestic workers. And two of the big groups that are working with work permits and that are quite vulnerable are domestic workers, and also in the hotel kind of industry, So I was going to ask Noel during the talk, and I didn't want to interrupt him, and then there wasn't time afterwards. He was talking about the collective agreements, So where you have a unionised workforce and where a national agreement has been negotiated through a partnership, that you know, there's kind of say it might improve the automatic statutory rights that you have, so the minimum wage and things like that, and the working hours. You know, a group negotiates and the wages are set a bit higher, and anyone within the industry has to kind of respect that collective agreement, right? But there aren't any collective agreements as far as I know. He mentioned that there aren't, that it excludes hotel workers in Cork. So I was curious then to ask him how that affects trade union representation and how it actually affects the workers, because he'd have much more insight into that, I think, than I would anyway, and maybe anyone else who's been involved in unions for years would know as well. And the other group that aren't represented as far as I know, that tend to be ununionised and that don't fall under any collective agreements, are again the domestic workers, okay? So you have your domestic worker. There was a lady last week in the news who got a very nice award from the Labour Relations Commission. She went to the Rights Commissioner first and then the Employment Appeals Tribunal, I think. And she was a domestic worker. She was from Malawi and she had a work permit. So she was, you know, she had her stamp 4, right, which is the immigration permission to work, and she had her work permit and she's working in someone's home. So you have a fairly invisible worker who's not connected to any colleagues, you know. You kind of are, you're kind of in a very isolated workplace. You're invisible, you're inside someone's home. And if you come from very far away in another country, it can make you quite vulnerable. She wasn't being paid properly. She was being paid way, way, way below the minimum wage. And she was expected to work outrageous hours, and she was expected to do every single thing. You know, there was no limit to what she was expected to do in the home. So she was a kind of a classic exploited worker. But she was one of many people who found herself very isolated, and it took a long time for her to go and seek help. And what she was told by her employers is something that a lot of other domestic workers and hotel workers and anyone else on work permits as well will have been told, which is, well, look, your work permit only entitles you to work for me. Your permission to remain in Ireland, your immigration status is dependent on that as well. So if you walk out on me because I'm not paying you right or you don't like the hours, you'll be deported. And there was a recording on the radio last week of a similar worker who had that conversation with her employers, and she taped it. And it was on a lot of radio programs. It's on YouTube, and it is unbelievable. And I just think it should be being played. I heard it was played on Morning Ireland. I didn't hear it, but someone told me. And I just think everyone should link it to every link they have on websites and stuff, because it really is an eye-opener. Because when this issue was raised with the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, which it has been loads of times by lots of different organisations, I'm sure the unions have brought it up with them, I know the immigrant rights groups have brought it up with them, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties have brought it up, the Human Rights Council have brought it up, this fact that the work permit holders are very vulnerable because they're tied to their employer, right? And the kind of answer is, and this again is something that Noel was talking about earlier on, is that the kind of answer that you get back from these outraged people is, but sure, Irish employers wouldn't exploit people like that. And, you know, I mean, they do have rights, and sure, they go to NERA, which, as we heard earlier on, is kind of very ineffective, and you don't hear back from them for 2 years, and then they make decisions that we mightn't all agree with. And that's kind of the answer that you hear back. So this recording last week was really, really strong in terms of undermining that that perception and of arguing with that. The strongest way, I think, to argue with it is to demonstrate it, you know. And so she had the tape recorder under the table, and you just could hear she was saying, look, I think you need to pay me more because this is below the minimum wage in Ireland, and I found out that this is how much the minimum wage is. And I also found out that I'm only supposed to work this many hours, and that I should have this much time off, and that I should have a certain amount of days off as well, you know. So I think I'm not happy with the way you're treating me. And the employer's answer was, well, look, you can't go working for anyone else. If you complain about this to anyone, we will fire you, and then you won't have a work permit anymore. And then he said, we'll put you in shackles and we'll take you to the airport. That was what he said to her, okay? Yeah. And I think if you raise this issue with politicians, they're like, no, it's not that bad, and there are protections, and employers won't be able to really exploit this. But the fact is that whatever the protections are, employers, I think, are exploiting it, and this was just a really strong kind of proof and demonstration of that happening. So that's really, really interesting. And that was posted online by the MRCI, which is the Migrant Rights, it's the Migrant...
It's Council of Ireland, is it?
No, they're an employee representative body for migrants in Dublin. MRCI, the Migrant Rights Council of Ireland. And they do campaigning, and they do a bit of representation, and they also take cases like to the Labour Relations Commission and to the Rights Commissioner and stuff like that. They're a really, really brilliant organisation, and what they have managed to do in Dublin, and